"The readings are not possible," the Velthari physician said, for the third time in as many minutes, as though repetition might eventually make the data cooperate. "Your cellular regeneration index is 14 times baseline for any cataloged species." 14. I want you to understand that I am not overstating this. Nolan Reyes looked up from the diagnostic table, considered the physician's expression, somewhere between professional composure and genuine alarm, and said, "Is that bad?" The physician stared at him. "I'm asking sincerely," Nolan said. "I don't have a reference point." That was, in a way, the problem. It was also, depending on how the next several hours resolved themselves, possibly the most significant understatement anyone had made in the Velthari Collective's medical bay in recorded history. It had started, as the worst weeks of Nolan Reyes's life tended to start, with paperwork. He was a field calibration technician for the Outer Reach Survey Division, a title that sounded more impressive than it was. In practice, it meant he traveled alone on a mid-range survey vessel to remote relay stations, corrected whatever had drifted in the equipment since the last visit, logged the corrections, and traveled back. The work was solitary, precise, and paid just well enough that he had never seriously looked for something else. He was 31 years old and had been doing this for 6 years, and nobody had ever once asked him to do anything that required more than competent technical knowledge and a tolerance for long stretches of silence. The vessel was called the Meridian Spur. It was not a remarkable ship by any standard that mattered. It did its job, so did Nolan. They had that much in common. The relay station he'd been sent to service, designation RS7 in the outer corridor lanes, had been showing irregular output signals for several weeks. Not dramatic ones, just the specific low-grade drift that happened when thermal cycling wore down component tolerances over time. Nothing urgent. The survey division had simply added it to Nolan's route, the way they added everything to his route, without discussion, because he was the technician assigned to the corridor lanes, and this was a corridor lane station. He had not known, when he filed his route departure and pointed the Meridian Spur toward RS7, that the relay station had been built at the edge of a contested navigation zone, a thin strip of space where the charts were genuinely disputed between 3 different parties, none of whom had ever quite gotten around to resolving the boundary in writing. His navigation system knew this. It had simply decided, through whatever internal logic governed its routing algorithms, that the most efficient path to RS7 clipped through a small section of that disputed zone. Not deeply. Less than 40 minutes of transit time at standard cruise. The Velthari patrol vessel had been waiting just inside that zone for reasons entirely unrelated to Nolan, scanning for a separate ship suspected of running contraband through the corridor bypass lanes. What they found instead was a lone human technician on a mid-grade survey vessel, traveling at legal cruise speed, who looked genuinely confused when they hailed him. "Survey Division, registration 77 Meridian," Nolan said when the hail came through. "I'm servicing RS7. My routing took me through this zone. I can see now that might be a problem, and I apologize for the confusion." There was a pause on the other end. Then, "Hold position, prepare for boarding and inspection." Nolan held position and prepared for boarding and inspection. He had been boarded before. Survey Division work occasionally brought him through checkpoints, and the procedure was familiar enough. He sat in the pilot chair, kept his hands visible, and waited. The 3 Velthari who came through his airlock were armored in the layered composite style that indicated military grade rather than standard patrol. They were tall, broad-shouldered, with the pale gray-blue coloring and ridge-crested skulls that he had seen in coalition briefings but never at close range. The lead officer, Nolan would later learn her designation was 3rd Enforcement Commander Soraya Dale, moved through the Meridian Spur's small interior, with the practiced efficiency of someone who had boarded a great many vessels and did not find them interesting. She found the ship's logs, confirmed the Survey Division filing, confirmed the RS7 service order. She found Nolan's credentials, his equipment manifests, his tool cases. Everything was exactly what it appeared to be. She found nothing contraband, nothing unusual. She ordered him detained anyway, pending formal review of the navigation zone incursion, which was standard procedure for a zone violation regardless of intent. Nolan did not argue. He knew how this worked. He would be held for a few hours, some documentation would be filed on both sides, and eventually he would be released with a notation on his record and a late RS7 service report to explain to the Survey Division. Inconvenient. Not catastrophic. What happened at the Velthari processing station 3 hours later was somewhat more complicated. The processing station was a mid-sized installation at the edge of the Collective's corridor jurisdiction, functional, institutional, lit in the cool white-blue spectrum that Velthari apparently preferred. Nolan had been escorted to a holding area, had his equipment secured, and was waiting with the particular patience of someone who had spent 6 years alone on a survey vessel and therefore had genuinely excellent practice at sitting quietly with nothing to do. It was during the initial medical screening, routine for all detained non-collective individuals, that things shifted. The physician on duty was a methodical woman named Dr. Itha Cassell. She had processed a significant number of non-collective species through this station and had developed a calm, professional neutrality about biological variation. Her expression when she ran the first diagnostic pass over Nolan was therefore not alarm, exactly, more the focused frown of someone encountering data that required double-checking. She checked it again. She recalibrated the diagnostic equipment, confirmed it was functioning correctly, and ran the scan a third time. "I need you to tell me about any medical treatments or enhancements you have received," she said, with the careful tone of someone choosing words precisely. "Genetic therapies, cellular augmentation, any procedures outside standard human medical practice." "Nothing like that," Nolan said. "I had my appendix out when I was 19, broke my collarbone twice, standard stuff." Dr. Cassell looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up her calm and said very quietly, "I need Commander Dale to come to medical." Commander Soraya Dale had been planning to finish the paperwork on the human technician's incursion by end of shift, log it, and move on to the 17 other matters that required her attention. She was not a person who enjoyed having her expectations interrupted. She stood in the medical bay doorway and looked at the diagnostic display that Dr. Cassell had pulled up, and said nothing for a moment. "Run it again," she said finally. "I've run it 4 times," Dr. Cassell said. Dale crossed the bay and studied the display herself, with the expression of someone who understood diagnostic data well enough to know that it was not lying to her and wished it were. Then she looked at Nolan, who was sitting on the diagnostic table with his hands on his knees, watching this exchange with the mild attention of someone who had not yet decided whether to be concerned. "Your cellular regeneration index," Dale said, "is 14 times baseline for any cataloged species." "So I heard," Nolan said. "Are you aware of this?" "I was not, until approximately 5 minutes ago." Dale studied him with the focused assessment of someone reconsidering a situation they thought they had already categorized. She was, by all visible evidence, not a person who recategorized things easily. Her authority in this station was absolute and completely unquestioned. She had commanded this posting for 4 years, and in that time had encountered every kind of complication the corridor lanes produced. She had not encountered this. "You came through a navigation zone violation in a mid-grade survey vessel," she said. "You are a field calibration technician." "That's correct. And you have cellular regeneration indices that would require 3 separate Velthari medical teams to explain to anyone's satisfaction." "That also appears to be correct," Nolan said. "I want to be clear that I don't have any more information about this than you do. I calibrate relay equipment. I'm not a biologist." Something passed through Dale's expression, not quite the flicker of amusement that she visibly suppressed, but something adjacent to it. "That is an unusual thing to say in this situation. I've been told I have a limited sense of self-preservation when it comes to saying accurate things at inconvenient moments," Nolan said. "Dr. Cassell looked between them with the expression of someone watching a dynamic they had not anticipated, and were not sure how to categorize professionally. The next 12 hours were the strangest of Nolan Reyes's life, which, given that he had once spent 4 days stranded on a malfunctioning relay platform with nothing but emergency rations and a non-functional communications array, was establishing a reasonably high bar. 2 additional Velthari physicians were called in. A collective research specialist who happened to be stationed at the installation for unrelated reasons found her schedule abruptly rearranged. The diagnostic equipment was recalibrated twice more, tested against known baseline scans, and confirmed to be functioning within all acceptable parameters. The data did not change. Nolan submitted to every test they asked for with the cooperative patience of someone who had nothing to hide, and also nothing to offer in the way of explanation. He answered questions as completely and accurately as he could, which was not very completely, because most of the questions were medical in nature, and he was a field calibration technician. What he could tell them: he healed quickly from minor injuries, had always healed quickly, had considered it a minor fortunate trait and never thought about it further. He did not get ill easily. He had worked in some moderately hazardous environments. Certain relay stations had elevated radiation profiles from their proximity to stellar bodies. and had never experienced the exposure effects that other technicians reported. He had not, until this moment, considered any of this particularly significant. "Your radiation exposure logs from the survey division," one of the additional physicians said, scrolling through the data Dale had requested from Nolan's personnel file, "show cumulative exposure levels that would typically require mandatory health monitoring and early retirement protocols." "I know," Nolan said. "HR flagged it. I had 3 different physicals. They all came back clean, and eventually the division decided the monitoring equipment at the affected stations must have been miscalibrated. And you accepted that explanation." "I calibrate monitoring equipment for a living," Nolan said. "I knew it wasn't miscalibrated. But I also didn't have a better explanation, and the physicals were clean, so I let it go." The physician looked at him with an expression that Nolan was beginning to recognize as the Velthari equivalent of being professionally overwhelmed. "You knew the equipment was accurate, and you chose not to pursue the question." "I had a route to keep," Nolan said simply. "RS-7 through RS-14 on a 6-week rotation. Whatever was happening inside my cells, it wasn't slowing me down." Commander Dale did not typically involve herself personally in the processing of detained individuals beyond what her command role required. She had staff for that. She had procedures. She found herself, that afternoon, sitting across a table from Nolan Reyes in one of the station's smaller meeting rooms, with 2 cups of something hot that her adjutant had brought without being asked, reading through the survey division's file on him, with a focus she usually reserved for tactical assessments. The file was not remarkable, that was the thing. 6 years of service. Consistently positive performance marks, noted primarily for accuracy and reliability rather than anything that looked like standout achievement. No disciplinary record. Educational background in systems engineering from a mid-tier technical institute. Family history. Parents in a regional logistics firm. No siblings. No particular distinguishing circumstances. A record that said in every conventional measure that this was a person who was competent at his job and otherwise unremarkable. "You've been doing this work for 6 years," she said. 6 years and 4 months, Nolan said. "And before that?" "Technical school. Before that, worked summers for my parents' logistics company. Before that, grew up in a mid-sized city in the Pacific Northwest, played baseball badly, liked building things, nothing interesting." Dale set down the file. "You were flagged for unusual radiation tolerance. You were flagged at a standard departure medical last year for elevated enzyme profiles that the division physician couldn't explain. You are currently registering biological metrics that 3 of my best medical staff cannot account for within every framework they have." She paused. "And none of this has ever changed anything about your life." "I didn't know about most of it," Nolan said. "The parts I knew about, they didn't change the work. The relay stations don't care what my enzyme levels are." "What do you care about?" Dale asked. And it came out differently than she had intended. Less procedural, more direct. Nolan considered the question with the same measured attention he had given every other question today. "Doing the work right," he said after a moment. "Making sure the equipment reads accurately, because the ships that navigate by those relays are trusting that the data is clean. Getting the route done on time because delays cascade. Not causing problems I don't need to cause." He glanced at her. "You could argue I've failed on that last one today. The navigation incursion was the equipment's error, not yours. Still ended up in your medical bay." "Yes," Dale said. "It did." She was quiet for a moment, and the quality of that quiet was different from her earlier silences, less commanding, more considering. "The research team wants to request a formal extended study. Coalition Scientific Division involvement. This is not something that can be contained to a station-level incident report." "I assumed," Nolan said. "How long are we talking? Weeks at minimum. Possibly longer." She watched him. "You have concerns. RS-7 still needs servicing," Nolan said. "The drift in that relay is going to keep compounding. 3 survey vessels use that lane as a primary navigation reference. If the output signal degrades past a certain threshold, they'll be routing around it, which adds 2 days to each run." He paused. "I'd like to request that the survey division be notified so they can send a replacement technician." Dale looked at him for a long moment. Something shifted in her expression. The flat administrative authority she had maintained for the last several hours, rearranging itself into something that required more careful characterization. "You are currently under detainment in a Velthari collective military installation," she said, with a precision that seemed directed more at herself than at him, "with biological profiles that will likely result in coalition-wide research interest, and you are requesting that someone cover your relay station route." "The work still needs doing," Nolan said. My being here doesn't change that. She came to the holding room that evening, not officially, not as part of any procedure. Her adjutant was not with her. She brought nothing except the kind of unscheduled appearance that her staff would later comment on quietly among themselves. My research team found something, she said, standing in the doorway. Nolan had been reading through a technical manual on his tablet. He had requested it from his equipment case, and whoever had approved the request had apparently decided a relay calibration manual posed no security risk. He set it down. The cellular regeneration index, Dale said, is the most dramatic finding, but it's not the only one. Your nervous system's processing architecture is measurably different from standard human baseline. Not radically, nothing that would show up on casual observation, but the speed at which you integrate spatial and mechanical information is in the 98th percentile of any species the collective has formally catalogued. Nolan was quiet for a moment. That's why you're so good at the calibration work, she said. And it wasn't a question. I thought I was good at it because I paid attention, Nolan said. You pay attention faster than most species are neurologically capable of, Dale said. You don't experience it as speed because it's simply the rate at which you process. You have no baseline comparison. She paused. Did anyone ever tell you that you were unusually gifted at this kind of work? My supervisor called me reliable, Nolan said, which I think is what she meant by, you're accurate and you're never late and I don't need to think about your route. Something in Dale's expression shifted, not the suppressed professional reaction he had seen earlier in the day, but something more unguarded, closer to the surface. That seems like a significant undervaluation, she said. Maybe, Nolan said, or maybe reliable is exactly what the work needs and everything else is beside the point. Dale stood in the doorway for a moment longer than the conversation strictly required. Outside the holding room, the station continued its shift rotation, her staff moving through their assigned tasks with the efficiency she had built over 4 years of command. The paperwork on the Nolan Reyes incursion was sitting on her desk, half completed. I intend to be present for the Coalition research team's initial meeting, she said. When the request comes through, and it will come through, I want to be in the room. That seems reasonable, Nolan said. You're the one who found me. The patrol found you, she corrected. I just ran the processing. The processing led to the medical scan, Nolan said, which led to Dr. Cassell calling you in, which led to all of this. He looked at her steadily. I'd say you found me. The holding room was quiet for a moment. The station hum filled the space between them, low and constant, the kind of background sound that became invisible after a while. You should sleep, Dale said finally. Tomorrow will involve a significant amount of additional testing. I figured, Nolan said. Commander. He said it with the specific inflection of someone acknowledging rank, while also acknowledging that the conversation had moved, somewhere in the last several minutes, into territory that didn't require it. Dale held his gaze for a moment. Then she turned and walked back toward her command deck, and the holding room door slid closed behind her, and Nolan Reyes sat alone with his calibration manual, and the quiet fact of the station around him. The Coalition research request came through at 0640 the following morning, faster than anyone had anticipated, which meant someone higher up the collective's reporting chain had already seen Dale's preliminary findings and moved quickly on them. The documentation listed 4 research divisions, a xenobiology team from a Coalition academic institution, and a request for Nolan's transfer to a dedicated research facility. Dale read it at her desk, noted the transfer language, and sent back a single amendment before approving the overall request. Survey technician Nolan Reyes to remain under collective jurisdiction, this station, for the duration of initial assessment. Commander Dale, 3rd Enforcement, presiding. Her adjutant read it when it came through for logging and said nothing, which was the appropriate professional response. He did add it to the file with a notation that it was non-standard, which was also appropriate, and then moved on to the rest of the morning's work. 3 weeks later, the Coalition research team had produced 47 pages of preliminary findings, none of which fully explained anything. The cellular regeneration data remained unexplained. The neurological processing data had spawned a secondary inquiry into whether similar profiles existed in the broader human population, undetected, which had opened a research thread that the xenobiology team estimated would take several years to resolve. Nolan Reyes had cooperated with every test, answered every question with complete accuracy, and asked, on day 4, whether it would be possible to access the station's technical systems so that he could assist with a calibration issue he had noticed in the long-range sensor array during one of the scanning sessions. The request had been reviewed, considered, and, After considerable internal discussion, granted on a supervised trial basis. He fixed the sensor array issue in 40 minutes. The maintenance team, which had been scheduling the repair for the following month, reported the correction up the chain with a notation that the methodology used was not one they had previously encountered, but was, upon review, clearly superior to their standard approach. Dale read that report at her desk and found herself doing something she did not usually do during working hours, which was sitting quietly with a small and entirely unprofessional sense of satisfaction. On the morning of the 22nd day, she found him in the station's observation bay. A narrow room with a wide viewport that looked out over the corridor lanes, the distant relay markers blinking their patient signals against the dark. He had requested access to the bay the previous evening, and she had approved the request herself, which was not standard for detainee privileges, but was also not a decision she had needed to think about for very long. R7 is out there, he said when she came to stand beside him. He didn't turn. He had apparently heard her coming, which she noted. Yes, she said. Bearing 112, approximately 40 light minutes from here. Did they send a replacement technician? They sent 2, she said. The first one filed an incident report saying the calibration drift was more complex than the work order described. The second one confirmed it. They've escalated it to a specialist team. Nolan was quiet for a moment. You would have handled it in an afternoon, Dale said. It was an observation, not a question. Probably, Nolan said. The drift pattern at RS7 has a specific signature. It's a thermal cycling issue, but it's compounded by a resonance feedback from the mounting assembly. You can't fix it by the book. You have to feel where the resonance is sitting and adjust for the assembly geometry specifically. He paused. The work order doesn't tell you that. You learn it by doing the route long enough that you know the station. Dale looked at the viewport, at the distant blinking signal of RS7 that she could now specifically identify because she had looked it up on the charts after he mentioned it on the first day. When this is over, she said, they will want to reassign you. The coalition research interest alone will generate recommendations. There will be people who want you somewhere other than a survey route. Probably, Nolan said again. How do you feel about that? He considered the question with the same deliberate attention he gave everything. The quality she had been cataloging without meaning to for 3 weeks, the specific way he weighted his words before committing to them. I like the work, he said. The route, the stations. There's something about knowing a place well enough to fix it when nobody else can. That's not. He paused, looking for the right words. That's not nothing. No, Dale said quietly, it isn't. The observation bay was still. Through the viewport, RS7 blinked its patient signal, waiting for someone who understood it. Whatever they decide to do with all those findings, Nolan said, someone still needs to service those relays. The ships still need accurate data. I know, Dale said. I'd like it on the record, he said, that my preference is to return to the route. I'll make sure it's noted, Dale said. When the coalition scientists convene, I'll be in that meeting, and your preference will be the first thing I put on the table. He turned to look at her then, not with the mild cooperative attention he directed at the medical staff, or the precise accuracy he brought to technical questions. Something more direct, more considered. Thank you, he said. For staying on it, you fixed my sensor array, she said. That seems like a reasonable exchange. The array was a separate matter, Nolan said. Perhaps, Dale said. Or perhaps I'm choosing to count it. Outside, the corridor lanes ran their quiet routes, relay markers blinking their patient signals, ships trusting the data to be clean. Somewhere in the middle distance, RS7 waited with its specific drift and its resonance feedback and its assembly geometry that only one person in the current situation fully understood. They stood in the observation bay for a while longer, neither of them saying much. There was between them the specific quality of silence that belongs to people who have learned each other's attention in a short and unusual time and know it, and are not yet sure what to do with that knowledge. The research team's next session was scheduled for 0900. Everything else would take considerably longer to resolve. And from the look Dale gave him before she turned to leave for her command deck, she was not in the least unhappy about that.